Welcome to the largest group of freshwater lakes in the world. You know the one I'm talking about, the interconnected lakes shared between Canada and the USA that eventually drains out of the St. Lawrence, known as the Great Lakes. At 244,106 kilometers square when combined, they are actually larger than the entire UK. Not that the UK is particularly large, ranking only at 78 in land area according to this Wikipedia list, but still, 5 lakes being compared with a significant country is still impressive. They are home to 21% of all surface fresh water on Earth, only surpassed by Lake Baikal in Russia, which holds 23% of all surface freshwater. And just to be clear here, we are only talking about surface freshwater, which only includes liquid water on the surface such as lakes and rivers. Collectively, the lakes hold 22,671 cubic kilometers of fresh water. To give you an idea of how much water that truly is, think of it this way. 1 cubic kilometer of water is about 1 trillion liters. So if you do the math here, the Great Lakes then contain 22 quadrillion 671 trillion liters of fresh water. Yeah, kind of hard to comprehend just how much water there really is here. I even had to Google what a quadrillion even was. Alright, so now that we have a better understanding of the enormousness of the Great Lakes, let's now talk about its massive basin. Although separate sub-basins, the 5 Great Lakes are one interconnected body of fresh water. Lake Superior is connected to Lake Huron through the St. Mary River. Lakes Michigan and Lake Huron are connected at the Straits of Mackinac and are technically one hydrological body or one lake, but they are in practice referred to as 2 separate lakes. Lake Huron is connected to Lake St. Clair via the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair being the intermediate lake just north of Detroit/Windsor. It's a lake, but just not one of the Great Lakes and is often forgotten altogether. The Detroit River then connects Lake St. Clair to Lake Erie. Lake Erie and Lake Ontario are connected with the Niagara River, with its dramatic drop in elevation creating the famous Niagara Falls. And finally, eastern point of Lake Ontario is the starting point of the St. Lawrence River, which flows to the Atlantic Ocean. Let's now add the drainage basins of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. I show both basins on this map because, well, they both drain out of the St. Lawrence estuary and they are kind of part of the same system. And this way we can actually truly appreciate the massive size of this drainage basin. Shared between both Canada and the USA, the basin spans from Minnesota all the way to the most eastern edges of Quebec. Interestingly, the only lake that does not have an international border going through it is Lake Michigan, which is completely within the USA. As mentioned previously with Lake St. Clair, there are other lakes and rivers that are part of this basin other than the Big Five. Starting from the western edge of the basin, we have Lake Nipigon in Ontario draining into Lake Superior via the Nipigon River. Lake Winnebago in Wisconsin drains into Lake Michigan. Lake Nipissing in Ontario, Lake Simcoe also in Ontario, the Ottawa River that flows into the St. Lawrence, the Richelieu River in Quebec, and Lac Saint-Jean with the Saguenay River. Now obviously I just mentioned the major ones. There are hundreds if not thousands of smaller rivers and creeks that are also part of this watershed. Now let's take a look at the elevation of these Great Lakes. By doing so, we can have a better understanding of the flow of the water, and in this case, why the water is flowing from west to east. This chart shows us clearly that Lake Superior is in fact at the highest elevation. This makes sense as rivers or freshwater bodies always flow from a higher elevation to a lower one, which in our case is the Atlantic Ocean, making the water flow west to east. Lake Superior sits at an elevation of 183 meters above sea level. Lake Superior is also the deepest of the Great Lakes with a depth of 405 meters. Hence why it's called Superior. It's just superior than the other ones. In actuality, it was called Lake Superior by the French as the lake was just kind of higher up than the other lakes. Anyways, our first drop in elevation in the system is the St. Mary's River, dropping about 7 meters into Lake Huron/Lake Michigan. It is interesting to see here that Lake Huron and Lake Michigan have the same elevation, as they are technically the same body of water. The water level then actually stays relatively constant at 176 meters, dropping only slightly to 173 meters by the end of Lake Erie. Lake Erie is also the shallowest of the lakes at 64 meters deep. Then we have the famous Niagara Falls, dropping the water level to 99 meters into Lake Ontario, which is actually larger than the distance of the deepest part of Lake Erie. And finally, we find ourselves at the end of the system with the St. Lawrence that brings the water gradually to the Atlantic Ocean. However, multiple rapids do exist before Montreal, hence why it was unnavigable before the construction of multiple canals in the late 1820s. Alright, now let's go back in time and find out exactly how these Great Lakes were even formed. And to answer that question, we have to go back to the last ice age that ended about 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. You see, back then, what would become modern Canada was mostly all under a deep, thick ice sheet known as the Laurentide ice sheet. But between 12,000 to 4,000 years ago, the climate warmed up considerably, slowly melting away the Laurentide ice sheet. And technically, we are still in the later stages of this ice age even today. Now, obviously, the retreat of the ice sheet left behind an enormous amount of meltwater, filling up a depression that we now know today as the Great Lakes. In the early stages of the melting event, there was in fact so much meltwater in the basin that the Great Lakes were in fact much larger, and three of the lakes, Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan, actually merged together to create what was known as Lake Algonquin. At its maximum extent between 11,000 to 10,000 years ago, Lake Algonquin flooded the Michigan Peninsula as well as some areas on the Ontario Peninsula. As the Laurentide ice sheet continued to melt, outlets formed, draining some of the water out of the basin and lowering the water levels, eventually forming the modern Great Lakes we know today about 4,000 years ago. Interestingly, one of those outlets was actually the Ottawa River, or should I say the ancestral Ottawa River, which connected the Great Lakes from present-day Lake Huron directly to the St. Lawrence River. Now, obviously, the Great Lakes region has played a fundamental role in the economic landscape of Canada. If we include the St. Lawrence River, as again the river acts essentially as the drainage basin for the Great Lakes, this region has been the economic heart of Canada since the very beginning. Without going too much into history, the St. Lawrence acted as the gateway into North America's interior. The natives of the region often called these lakes freshwater seas and often used the interconnected lakes as superhighways using canoes. The French simply adopted this way of rapid travel and soon discovered the extent of the massive river and lake system. Seeing the potential for rapid transport to the interior and given the abundance of furs in the region, the French made a business out of fur trading and created forts and settlements along the arteries of this system. So already we can see that the river and lake system from the very foundation of the colony that would become Canada was the economic backbone of the country. Fast forward to the Canadian Confederation of 1867, and here we can see that Canada was essentially defined geographically by the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. The country basically just straddled the basin with the addition of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Canada's major cities, its industry, its population, and its agriculture all basically existed within the banks of the river system and the lake system. Back then, Canada was the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence. Throughout the country's development in the 20th century, the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River continued to play a pivotal role in the country's economy. During the western colonization of the prairies, grain was transported through the Great Lakes and shipped to Montreal where it could be sent to international markets. Remember that the first iteration of the Welland Canal, the one around Niagara Falls, and multiple other canals in the St. Lawrence River had been built in the 1820s and were constantly being improved so that the whole system was navigable. In fact, almost all Western resources from this time period were transported first by land to essentially Thunder Bay and then shipped across the Great Lakes to eventually find its way to Montreal. This was, after all, an era before highways, planes, and freight trains. Montreal essentially acted as the port of Canada. Today, although Montreal has lost the title of largest port to Vancouver and shipping on the Great Lakes has become much less important, the region is still the economic heart of Canada. The Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region holds about 50% of the Canadian population, is home to the largest and second largest city, and is also home to the nation's capital, making the region an important economic corridor for the country. Being also the birthplace of the nation, the region is home to Canada's original rivalry, Ontario versus Quebec, a rivalry that still has immense influence on the political direction of Canada today. The Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence might not be the drivers of industry and shipping that they once were, but it is undeniable to say that the Windsor to Quebec corridor is still the core of Canada, even when considering the significant growth of Western Canada in the last century. Maybe one day Western Canada will finally catch up. Alright, so that is it for today's video. I hope you've learned something new about the Great Lakes of North America, as they have played quite a pivotal role in Canada's development, and it's just kind of very mind-boggling just how much water and fresh water is actually found in those Great Lakes. So if you've enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and even subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.